me today and inviting me here to talk to you. My subject for today is going to be a little bit varied, and you probably don't even know what I'm going to talk about. But I'm going to talk about the first two ministers that we had here at Western Boulevard, Reverend Bob Bluford and Russell Fleming. And I have right much information on them, and I knew each one of them personally. I don't know whether most of you had that opportunity to know them. Just excuse me, let me get to my notes here. I don't know that you met my three daughters, Laura, Beth, and Amy.
I've tried.
And I refer to those oftentimes as the three little women. And there is a story behind that I'll share with some of you sometime. But not today. I got a lot to go over with. I'll try to be brief in this talk rather than tedious. I don't want to bore you, and if you get bored with what I'm saying, just get up and leave. 70 years ago, there was a knock on my door when we lived out on Meredith Street, just off of Buck Jones Road. And that was in the year 1954, in the summer. We had just moved into that new house from an apartment in Cameron Village. Bob Bluford, with that knock, introduced himself to me and asked if he could talk to me a little bit. I hesitated in even inviting him in the house. I thought at first he was probably one of the Jehovah's Witnesses type with some literature. Joyce was not home. She was working in the emergency room at Rex Hospital. And I finally said, come on in. And we had a very, very enjoyable conversation. And I have often wondered over the years, why did Bob Bluford visit me that day? I had never heard of him, and I don't know how he heard of me. I think I figured it out though. And it's bothered me all of these years as to why he came, because it was a life-changing thing for me and my family. Excuse me just a minute, I get my breath. I guess those beyond the allotted 70 years may call themselves seniors. I think that's just a nice way of saying old folks. I do prefer the senior, and those that are beyond that and up in the 90s, they ought to be called super seniors. I don't think any of y'all have reached that stage yet. But shortly after we moved into that house, my father drove down from Pittsburgh, where he was normally in the courthouse, and he wanted to check out the new house. When he got ready to leave, and it was going on supper time, and I think he had stayed for supper with us, but he said, I want to introduce you to some nice folks. And we got into the car, and he drove up to Burke's Hardware. Mm-hmm. We went in there, and he got hold of John and Paul Burke, and he introduced me to them and said they were a good Chatham County family. I do not know how he got to know the Burke family that well. I do know they were from down in the Ghost and Bear Creek area of Chatham. But how did he know they were connected to Burke's Hardware? I haven't figured that out yet, but I'm working on it. That's gonna be another project and another story, and I'll let y'all in on it. But those two Burke boys were the first members of Western Boulevard Presbyterian Church that I ever met. And I'm still proud to call them friends. The visit by Bob Bluford made a life-changing stay in our lives. I'd like to describe Bob for you. As I recall him, he was a slim man of medium height. He carried himself well in a military manner. He was soft-spoken and articulate. He and I hit it off very quickly. I enjoyed an hour or more of conversation with Bob, and we discussed a multitude of topics, ranging from infant baptism to immersion. I was raised in the Baptist church, as was Joyce, and that was an issue with me before we transferred to Western Boulevard. He invited us to attend his church, which was a little church over there on Cheney Road, just off Western Boulevard. And we did accept his invitation, and we made a visit. The church was constructed of clapboard from surplus military barracks buildings from World War II. They purchased enough to build that church for $700. I took little notice of the church building itself, other than to note that it was maintained very well, which was a positive reflection on the members of the church. Except with the thought that I thought I was through with military type construction. Finding a seat in the small church was the problem. There was a single aisle. The sermon was from the heart, and it was delivered by Reverend Bluford as if he was speaking directly to each individual in the congregation. Royce and I joined the church in July of 1957, and as I said earlier, it was a dramatic change from the upbringing in a Baptist facility. We quickly adapted and were accepted by a very friendly membership. However, when my brother Tommy, and Tommy and I were very close, heard that we were joining the Presbyterian Church, he said, "Who ever heard of John the Presbyterian?" It was John the Baptist. Well, my retort to that was, a Presbyterian is just a Baptist that got educated. Well, the last time that I met Tommy, which was back this past summer, he was still talking about that. He was a very strict churchgoer. I don't know of a man that lived a Christian life more so than he did. But anyway, let's get back to Bob Booth. He was born in 1918. During that period between 1900 and 1925, which became known as the Greatest Generation, he attended Hampton Sydney College, entering as a 22-year-old freshman. He had to make some money before he entered that liberal arts school. And he began his road to the ministry at Hampton Sydney. The Hampton Sydney College began as a log college, form of higher education established by the Scotch-Irish Presbyterians in America. And that form of education is related to North Carolina as well as Virginia through the log college concept of David Caldwell in Guilford County. And David Caldwell was connected with the Hawfields Presbyterian Church, from which our second pastor came, Russell Fleming. Bob's education was interrupted in May of 1942 when he enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Corps. And that's not Air Force. In World War II, that was part of the U.S. Army. It was the Air Corps. And during the war years of World War II, the enrollment at Hampton-Sydney dropped to a low of 46 students. That must have upset the girls at nearby Longwood College. Bob served with the 8th Air Force as a pilot on a B-24 bomber and a squad leader in the 466th Bomb Group flying out of Adelbridge, England. I found some photos of Bob in the Air Museum, the American Air Museum in England. And I'd like to share those with you today. There's photo number 1, and Beth, if you would pass those out and just pass them around, and we'll pick them up at the end. In photo number 1, Bob is the officer on the far right as you face the picture. In photo number 2, Bob is shown by the plane he flew. And note the name of the plane. In photo number 3, he is shown leaning out of the cockpit window of Parsons' chariot. In photo 4 is a photo of the cockpit of a B-24 heavy bomber. And remember that cockpit photo, and we'll pass it around again near the end of my talk. There is a need for that. A little side story. You know, I'm having to do a lot of leaning, so excuse that. But I'd rather talk standing up where I can face you, where you can see me. During World War II, at my home in Chatham County, our farmhouse was located on a high, open, rural area and was designated as an official aircraft spotting post, manned by members of our family. My brother Bob and I were spotters, and when any aircraft was spotted, we rang the telephone central operator and called the code word Army Flash, and we were immediately connected to Fort Bragg. We reported the aircraft, identification, and heading. We became well versed in identifying silhouette photos of U.S. aircraft from the manuals furnished to us. The 4-engine bomber flown by the Army Air Corps were the B-24 and the B-17. Bob returned to Hampton-Sydney at the end of World War II. He graduated in 1947 as valedictorian, and then proceeded to Union Theological Seminary, where he received his master's and doctoral certificates. No, I'm fine. In 1951, Bob became the first pastor of Western Boulevard after serving for a time as the pastor to the students at VPI. And if you're not familiar with VPI, that's been a junior polytech institution. And it was an institution, I guess. But it's now known as Virginia Tech. And we have an alumnus of that fine institution. But he must have got tired of contending with the students and decided he'd take the job down at Western Boulevard. When he came in, he had a very small nucleus to work with. There were 23 charter members of the church, and that was it, 23 people. And that had grown from a smaller nucleus that met in an old garage building from an outpost of the West Raleigh Presbyterian Church. And when we joined the church, I noticed we had a lot of professors and employees from NC State. And I often wondered why. West Raleigh Presbyterian Church was formed in 1927, and the first meetings of that church were in office buildings on the NC State campus. And as a result, a lot of the professors and students became acclimated to the Presbyterian form of worship. And they actually did a survey of that campus and found that there were some 40 professors and 200 students that were Presbyterians. That constituted the background of why we had so many professors in our first congregation. And they maintained that relationship over the years. As you go through some of the pictorial directories, you'll see in the back of those directories that a lot of them were still coming from the NC State campus. But I'll say one thing, the professors that were in our church, and I met, and I was friends with an awful lot of them, were much friendlier than the ones that in the classrooms that I sat in. The only published history of our church appears in the 1949 pictorial directory, which includes the years up through 1969. So we're missing an awful lot. And there's a statement in that one-page history that says, due to limited space, we're not able to name all of those who have helped the church. That is a poor excuse for omitting history. And it has always bothered me. And I made up my mind that I was going to somehow find the names of the 23 charter members and have them published. They need to be known. And I've got that list today, thanks to some of your hard-working church staff and volunteers, Marcia Bennett and Judy Shelton. So at the end of the meeting today, if you want a copy of the those that form that 23-member nucleus class, I have it. And I intend to do more with it. Hopefully, I'll be able to put together a small booklet on those members and flesh out their life a little bit. I think they need to have that. The only one that I know of that is acknowledged in a place where we might see it is in the church parlor. And if you go up there, look at that little plaque under the mantle. More on that a little later. Bob Bluford had a passion for history, and during his ministry, which was long in the state of Virginia after he left us, he had a passion for historic sites, and his achievements were many and the awards that he received were many. He was recognized in the year 2011 when he received the Virginia Press Association Award as Virginian of the Year. When asked about the awards that he had received over the years, he has been quoted as saying that he is just as happy in seeing the everyday impact of his work. And you remember our Standing on the Promise celebration. Bob Bluford came down for that celebration at the age of 100. And he was able to see the impact of his work in our church from the seeds of faith that he planted from the years 1951 to 1957 at Western Boulevard, which started at that little church on Cheney Road. Bob died at the age of 103, and to read the expressions of sympathy and devotion in his obituary is to read a description of the man and how he was inspired, an inspiration to so many. I found the names of Ronnie and Carolyn and Steve Hanna in those condolences. So he was not forgotten, not appropriately acknowledged, however. I'd like to list some of the more descriptive terms used in the condolences. Humble nature, would that there were more like him, a fountain of knowledge, passionate for local history, tremendous wisdom and perspective, fortunate for his influence in my life, a guiding light, a magnificent example of Christian service. Families' lives were enriched. In the pursuit of his projects, he has been described in just 4 words as perseverance without making an enemy. He was very dogged, never gave up on a project, and kept pursuing it. Here are a few snippets from his life. He was an author, preservationist, minister, and advocate for the American Indians. He served on the United Indians Board of Directors and was the only non-Indian on that board. He was inspired by a news article on the proposed construction on an Indian burial ground. And for years he pursued a memorial for the Indians of Virginia, and he sought with the Board of Indians to recover 2,000 skeletons from the Smithsonian Institute for a proper burial. Bob lost count of the number of weddings in which he officiated. He never charged a fee. He said 20 minutes at the shrimp bowl at the reception was his fee. To use a quote about his life, I didn't suffer in boredom. Always something, was never bored. It's ironic that the location of the historic Pole Green Church was discovered by Bob Bluford when he stepped on a brick and located the foundation of the church where Patrick Henry was a conjuror, and where the Reverend Samuel Davies, Virginia's first licensed non-Anglican minister, preached. In Frank's sermon of January 21st, he opens with, "What causes us to put one foot in front of the other in a certain direction?" The response to that question, as it applies to Bob Bluford, can be found in a verse in Psalm 37. The steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord. The Richmond Times-Dispatch article by Bill Lohman, and that one out, Bill, Bob Bluford, Driving Force for the Greater Good, and you can hand all of those out. Thanks to the efforts of Reverend Dr. Robert Bluford, a foundation and memorial were established to preserve the historic Pole Green Church in Hanover County, a significant site in the history of religious liberty in America. He was inspired to write a biography of Samuel Davies. It's available on Amazon, entitled Living on the Borders of Eternity, the story of Samuel Davies and the struggle for religious toleration in colonial Virginia. I have a copy, and it's on my next book list after I finish a 10-volume set of Western novels that I'm working on. I got about another 1,000 pages of them. He also authored the Battle of Tocopelone Creek, Pole Green Church, and the prelude to Cold Harbor. And that Pole Green Church was destroyed in the Battle of Cold Harbor. Most of the senior citizens who have reached the mid-90s have ceased driving an automobile. Bob Bluford, at the age of 97, is reported to have taken the controls of a B-24 and flew it. See the cockpit photo that we passed out earlier. That concludes what I had to say on Bob, and I will talk a little bit about Russell Fleming. But in closing on Bob Bluford, there is a quote in the Journal of Backcountry Studies that has a perfect description of Presbyterian Scotch-Irish who valued perspiration, perseverance, piety, and passion. A perfect description of Bob Bluford. I would call your attention to the fact that the Protestant work ethic, also known as the Calvinist work ethic, or the Puritan work ethic, is a work ethic in sociology, economics, and history. Say Wikipedia. Do I have any questions about Bob Bluford? Well, while you try to think of something, let's go on by and talk a little bit about our second pastor. He was not nearly as well known, but I don't think he's been recognized enough for what he did. When he came here in 1957 to replace Bob Bluford, and actually it was in 1958, Bob Bluford had been gone a year. And but Russell was not like Bob. Russell looked like a minister. He had that stern appearance about him. He didn't really stand out in a crowd. He was kind of quiet and reserved. He was the son of a minister, the Reverend Nathan Neely Fleming Jr. and Jessamine Booth. Russell was born April 3rd, 1924, and he died in 1990 at the age of 66, at a relatively young age. At his death, he was the pastor of Mount Carmel Presbyterian Church of Steele's Tavern, Virginia. Russell grew up in the Presbyterian Church in Alamance County, where his father was minister. He is buried in the Hallfields Presbyterian Church Cemetery near his parents. And that church was full of Scotts. Carr Scott, the governor, Bob Scott, the governor, and Senator Ralph Scott, all members of Hawfield's Presbyterian Church. Now, when Russell arrived at Western Boulevard, he faced a very daunting task of leadership. He had that. But the church needed someone that pushed them, and he pushed them to, in just a 2-year time frame, to move from that little church made from a military barracks building to the current location here. And this was our first sanctuary, the education building, as we call it. And a lot of the early times of the church faced financial difficulty. And before we could get a mortgage to sustain the construction, members of the congregation had to assume a portion of the mortgage by signing an agreement that they would support in a specific amount of money in the case of default by the church. That they had enough signatures and commitments in just a few days to get the mortgage assured and start construction. I think that Walter Eanes was the chairman of the building committee. I have not been able to verify that, but it's probably in the church register somewhere. When Russell was appointed chaplain of the state senate, he published a little book, Daily Prayers. I don't know if we have that in our church library, but we do have a church member who has volunteered to try to help us find a copy of that. I think we do need one in our library. When Russell arrived at our church, he was a bachelor. He was married in 1964 to Marilyn Morgan Hutchinson. Marilyn was a member of our church. She had a daughter, Kathy, and a son, Charles. At his death, Russell had a son, James, called Rusty, and another son, Robert Nathan Fleming. And from what I found, Robert Nathan was in China at the death of Russell. I assume that he was in some type of a preaching position. I'm not sure. That needs to be pursued too. The church was always in a financial crunch, especially when Russell was pastor. We had a lot of obligations, a lot of debts to pay. I will always remember the time Russell helped when we did not have enough funds to pay the electric bill. At that time, the deacons met separately from the session on the same evening. The session met in the pastor's office, and we met in the church parlor. The deacons at that time handled all of the finance, paid the bills, maintained the building and grounds. In other words, they did the down and dirty work. And some of that was pretty down and dirty. They did a lot of maintenance. I helped dig a catch basin outside the door. But on that night, when the deacons finished their meeting, we were waiting on the session, and their long-term meeting finally got over, and they came into the parlor, and we had a joint meeting. We explained the problem with the paying the light bill. Russell said, no problem, waive my salary. And that's what we did, and the light building got paid. That's how committed the man was. maybe we should have adopted the practice that was used in some of the Presbyterian churches in North Carolina in the early 19th century. Rent the pews. I was reading some early church minutes of the Alamance Presbyterian Church in Orange County when I ran across an entry that grabbed my attention, wherein a committee was appointed to call on and encourage a specific member to pay his past due pew rent. Any such action at Western Boulevard for a pew would have been met with squatters' rights and hard stare. Sometimes actions from the sublime to the ridiculous occurred in these meetings. And we were again looking at funds and how to pay some of them. And I was in the session then, and so was Roy Larson, a very good friend of mine. And I suggested that we quit buying flowers for the church for each Sunday meeting. Roy hit the ceiling. He was in the horticulture department, and there's an azalea named for Roy. So I quickly dropped the subject before I shut up. Russell was the type of person, not flashy, low key, and one who would not stand out in a crowd or meeting. He was a good administrator. Being single, he was more like one of the boys. He used to join Billy Smith, Carla Smith, Ed Isbell, Steen Hanna, and myself in our Historic Society meetings. He came along just like one of us. Walter Eanes, another member, operated the Auto Clinic in downtown Raleigh, and Jimmy Lee worked in that clinic. I think it was just the two of them. And as I was waiting for my car to be turned over to me after some service work, Walter got to laughing about Russell. He said, "I cannot find any parts for that Toyota automobile he drives. And I had to actually make a carburetor to get it to run." I don't know how Russell got that car, but I seem to remember that it came from California and he drove it from California. Now, there were some of those stories. But getting back to the church charter members, the plaque up in the parlor is in memory of Bobby Lou Cole Massey, charter member. Does anyone here know of Bobby Lou?
She was my classmate.
Good, I'm glad.
We got in touch with, we were in touch with her and found out that she was a charter member.
Yeah.
And her husband had that put in the parlor.
Well, I think more of that needs to be done. And what I plan to do is to flesh out the lives of all of those charter members and put together a little booklet that we can keep in our library. But other than that, I'd like to speak just briefly on Brady Jeffcoat, which most all of you know Brady. I considered him a close friend, but Brady was pretty suspicious of people that tried to get close to him. He thought that they were after something, and he had to learn the people and accept them before he would show any friendship. But Brady and I would meet at the fairgrounds. Both of us were collectors. We had different things that we tried to collect, but one of the things that Brady collected was air rifles. And I mentioned to Brady one day that I had a double barrel air rifle when I was a boy, and they are pretty rare. And I looked one up last night on eBay, $3,000. Well, I don't know what ever happened to mine. I think my mother gave it away to her nephew. But anyway, I found one over at the flea market one day, and it was in pretty bad shape, but I knew that it could be restored. No cell phones in those days. I went home and called Brady, and he immediately drove back to the flea market for his second visit that day, found it, and bought it. It's now in the Brady Museum down in Murfreesboro. That one that I found in the flea market. The other one I'd like to tell you about was in his collection at his home. He had a wooden box there that looked just like a box to me, and he opened it one day. He said, "Look at here," and he flipped the latch, pulled it apart, and it was a backpack portable organ that a pastor in the Alaska wildlands could put it on his back and go out and service the constituents. Wow. There was a priest or pastor up there that wanted it very badly, and he called Brady, and Brady would not offer to sell it to him. Brady's motto that he lived by: I buy it, I don't sell it, I keep it. And that was Brady. Well, that Alaskan priest showed up down here, and he came to Brody's house, and Brady, he must have accepted the guy, for he finally said, "Here, take it," and he gave it to him. Don't tell him what that item was, but that was Brady for you. If he liked you and accepted you, he'd do anything for you. When he first started to work, he had a problem. His right arm was damaged in an automobile accident, and as a 16-year-old boy in the Depression era, he had a hard time finding a job. He finally went to a textbook warehouse, and he put his hand in his pocket, and he got a job. And it was from that day, the manager of that warehouse took a liking to him, and Brady became a self-made man. He worked hard. He built a number of houses from scrap lumber, and most of those were built in the vicinity of Western Boulevard over on Gorman Street near the McKimmon Center. In his early days, in order to earn enough to put a meal on the table, he cleaned out dug wells. That's a well where you have a crank and your bucket goes down and you raise the water with the bucket. And he would charge $5 to clean out those wells, provided he could get somebody to help lower him down into the well on a rope. Well, I was restoring an old 100-year-old house and doing all the work myself, and I had a dug well, but it was located in the crawl space. And there's no way I could get down in it. I couldn't even get a ladder down in it. I considered that. And I couldn't get the jet pump to work. I finally pulled out 32 feet of double lines, threw it in the back of my pickup truck, and drove from west of Siler City to Brady's house over here in Raleigh. And we laid it out in the yard, and problem solved. that was the type of man it was. He'd do anything for you, and I miss Brady tremendously. Dan Pope was a charter member and a member of the first session. Dan stood with us as we joined the church and as each of our children were baptized. He was a figure that had a grandfatherly appearance, if you know what I mean by that. Someone that you could look to and feel a lot of trust in what he would tell you and what he would do. That concludes most everything I have to say. I hope you got all the pictures circulated, and I would try to answer any questions. But I mentioned the charter members. We do have a list that was developed, and you thank Judy and Marcia for that. And if you would like a copy of the original charter members, those are available for a handout today. Any questions? Jack?
It's not a question. When I first came to the church, I think it was in the 1960s, and I went home from a men's meeting, and I told my wife, I said, I just met the darndest character you ever heard. She says, what was that? I said, this guy claims he's got a 5-gallon jug full of quail feet. And I questioned him, and I said, I never heard of such a thing. Well, the next meeting we had, he brought his 5-gallon jug of quail feet, and that was Brady Jeffco.
Well, I'll always remember Gene Galetta. Gene was another one of the professors from NC State. I don't know what department he was in. He wasn't in engineering, I know that.
He was a Bluebeard man, I believe, wasn't he? That was his specialty, Bluebeards.
But I remember the only sermon that I can remember with anything in it, and I must have attended nearly 3,000 in this church, was the one preached by Gene Galetta, and he was a layman, member of our session, and he preached from right over there, and the name of his sermon was A Firebug for Christ. That just stuck with me all these years. And I mentioned that in our celebration several years ago, and Jean's daughter was here at that celebration. If you remember her, she was crippled a little bit. But anyway, when I mentioned Jean's name, she burst out and cried in church. Well, I thank you for your attention today, and I hope you get invited back again sometime.
I have one comment. You mentioned how adventurous Bob Luford was in his driving at 97. Did you commemorate one of your birthdays with something a little different, maybe recently?
Did what?
Did you commemorate one of your latest birthdays?
Yeah.
Well, people do crazy things. But I made my mind up last year. I've always loved horses. I started riding horses when I was 6 years old. I had one all my life until I left home. And then I still had one up there. I rode my brother's horse. I wanted to get on a horseback one more time, and on my 94th birthday, I went horseback riding. I don't think I'm gonna be able to do it on the 95th.